Hello. I ask for your subscription to grow the channel and increasingly improve the quality of the stories. And now, let's get started. I need to warn you about Death Valley. The things I witnessed there, they shouldn't be possible. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've spent the last 15 years documenting extreme weather phenomena. Until last week, I thought I understood how temperature and climate worked in even the most hostile environments. But what I encountered in Devil's Golf Course defied every natural law I knew. The airings on my equipment that first evening should have been my cue to leave. Instead, misscientific curiosity got the better of me. That curiosity almost cost me my life. The day started normally enough. With the merciless sun beating down on my Winnebago Voyages, I carefully navigated the winding road toward Badwater Basin. The AC struggled against the punishing heat, but my specialized equipment kept the interior at a manageable 85 mm. I'd done countless shoots in extreme conditions before. The Sahara, the Australian outback, even Death Valley itself. But something felt different this time. The air seemed to ripple with more than just heat waves, and the crystalline salt formations cast shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's position. Old Jim, the prospector I met at the last gas station in Furnace Creek, tried to warn me. His weathered face had creased with genuine concern as he grabbed my arm, telling me to avoid filming the sunset over the salt flats. "The light plays tricks," he'd said, his voice trembling. "It awakens things that should stay sleeping." I smiled politely and assured him I'd be careful, dismissing his words as local superstition. Now, I understand he wasn't trying to preserve some tourist attraction or protect a secret mining claim. He was trying to save my life. My campsite setup was methodical, as always. The thermal imaging cameras were arranged in a 180-degree arc around the RV, each one carefully calibrated to record temperature variations throughout the night. The main camera was mounted on a specialized rotating platform, ready to capture the sunset time-lapse I'd planned. The weather station displayed a scorching 125 Fat for PM. Everything was working perfectly. Too perfectly, in retrospect. The sun began its descent, painting the salt formations in brilliant oranges and reds. Through my viewfinder, I watched crystalline structures catch and reflect the light in mesmerizing patterns. The temperature reading showed 118 degrees, typical for late afternoon. But as I zoomed in on a particularly striking formation, something caught my eye. The digital display flickered, jumping suddenly to 32-degree Kurk. I tapped the screen, assuming a malfunction. That's when I heard it. A sound like cracking ice, impossible in this heat. The horror was about to begin. The temperature anomaly should have been impossible. Death Valley holds the record for the highest reliably recorded temperature on Earth, never dropping below freezing even in winter. Yet here I was, watching my professional-grade equipment register temperatures that would freeze mercury solid. Even more disturbing, I could still feel the desert heat on my skin, while the displays showed these impossible readings. I checked every sensor, recalibrated each device, but they all showed the same thing. Something was very, very wrong. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, I noticed the salt formations beginning to change. The crystals that had sparkled so brilliantly in the sunset now seemed to absorb the remaining light, creating pools of darkness deeper than simple shadows. The crackling sound grew louder, and I swear I could see frost forming on the edges of the nearest formations, despite the air still being hot enough to bake bread. My cameras were recording everything, but what they captured would later defy explanation. Inside the RV, I frantically reviewed the footage, frame by frame. The thermal imaging showed something that made my blood run cold. A pattern of extreme temperature inversions moving across the salt flats like a living thing. Where the normal infrared signature should show heat radiating from the ground, there were instead perfect circles of absolute cold, expanding and contracting like a heartbeat. They were moving closer to my campsite. The rational part of my mind tried to find scientific explanations. Could it be some unknown geological phenomenon? A rare atmospheric condition? But as I watched the thermal patterns pulse and shift with obvious intelligence, I knew I was witnessing something beyond the realm of natural science. The patterns were forming shapes, humanoid shapes that seemed to emerge from the salt formations themselves, leaving trails of impossible cold in their wake. My equipment began to fail in sequence, each device shorting out with a burst of static and a final reading of temperatures far below anything ever recorded on Earth. The laptop I used for data logging froze solid, its screen cracking from the impossible thermal stress. Outside, the crackling had become a constant symphony, and I could see my breath condensing in there inside the RV, even as sweat continued to roll down my face from the desert heat. Through the RV's windows, I watched in horror as the impossible became reality. The humanoid shapes I'd seen on thermal imaging were now visible to the naked eye, transparent distortions in the air that seemed to bend both light and heat around them. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence, flowing between the salt formations like liquid mercury. My scientific mind struggled to process what I was seeing, even as my instincts screamed at me to run. But where could I run in the middle of Death Valley? Each entity, and I can't think of a better word for them, seemed to create its own bubble, of extreme cold, visible now as patches of frost that formed and immediately evaporated in the hot air. They were feeding somehow, drawing in the ambient heat and transforming it into that unnatural cold. The process defied every law of thermodynamics I knew, yet I was watching it happen. My cameras, the few that still worked, were capturing it all. If I survived, I knew this footage would revolutionize our understanding of everything. The old prospector's warning echoed in my mind. The light plays tricks. But these weren't tricks. These entities were real, and they were closing in on my RV. The temperature swings became more violent as they approached. One moment I was wiping sweat from my forehead, the next my teeth were chattering uncontrollably. The metal walls of the RV groaned under a thermal stress, and I heard the ominous sound of pipes beginning to crack. I tried to start the engine, but the starter just clicked uselessly. When I opened the hood, I discovered the engine block was covered in a thick layer of frost, even as the air around it wavered with visible heat waves. The entities had surrounded my vehicle completely now, their forms more defined in the growing darkness. They seemed to be studying me, or perhaps they were savoring the moment before they fed on whatever warmth they could draw from my body. That's when I remembered something else old Jim had said, something about the entities being drawn to movement and heat. In desperation, I powered down everything in the RV that could generate warmth. The refrigerator, the battery system, even my phone. I sat absolutely still in the growing darkness, barely daring to breathe, as the temperature continued to fluctuate wildly around me. It was my only chance for survival. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat motionless in my darkened RV, watching these heat-eating entities glide past my windows. They seemed frustrated by my stillness, their forms becoming less distinct as they searched for signs of thermal activity. The desert night grew darker, but I dared not turn on any lights. My breath came out in visible puffs one moment, then disappeared in the scorching air the next. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I waited, hoping my theory about their attraction to heat was correct. My scientific mind, even in this terror, couldn't help but observe their behavior. They moved with a strange symmetry, like a dance choreographed around thermal currents. When they passed through the salt formations, the crystals would momentarily glow with an eerie blue light, then turn black as all heat was drawn out of them. I realized the formations weren't just their hunting ground. They were part of some ancient mechanism that allowed these entities to exist in our world, using the extreme temperature differentials as a bridge between dimensions. Around midnight, I noticed a pattern in their movements. They seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the heat waves that had distorted the air during the day, but in reverse. Every time the night air would normally cool, they would generate that impossible cold, and vice versa. They were creating a perfect inverse of the desert's natural thermal cycle. The implications were staggering. They weren't just feeding on heat, they were transforming it into its opposite. The entities began to change as the night wore on. Their forms became more erratic, less defined, as if they were struggling to maintain their presence in our reality. The temperature swings grew less extreme, and I could see frost melting from the salt formations even as new patterns formed. They were weakening, but I knew dawn was still hours away. He had Tormain absolutely still, conserving every bit of heat. Signature I could. As the first hints of pre-dawn light began to appear on the horizon, the entity's movements became frantic. They swirled around the RV one last time, their forms now barely visible except for the way they bent the starlight. The temperature stabilized gradually, returning to the desert's natural heat. But I waited another hour after sunrise before I dared to move, before I tried to start the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I didn't look back. I'm writing this from a motel in Las Vegas, 3 days later, after my footage has been analyzed by every expert I could find. Most of the video files are corrupted. The extreme temperature fluctuations destroyed most of my equipment, but a few clips survived, showing those impossible thermal readings and strange distortions in the air. No one can explain what I captured, and I'm not sure I want them to. Some things are better left unexplained, some doors better left closed. The old prospector was right about the sunset, about how the light awakens things that should stay sleeping. These entities, whatever they are, have found a way to exist in one of the hottest places on Earth by creating their own inverse temperature zones. They feed in heat itself, leaving behind pockets of cold that shouldn't be possible. And they're growing. Stronger. Each year, Death Valley breaks new temperature records. Each year, their hunting grounds expand. I've spent my career documenting extreme weather phenomena, trying to understand the forces that shape our world. But what I encountered in Death Valley exists outside the bounds of natural law. These entities aren't just feeding on heat, they're transforming it, using the salt formations as some kind of dimensional anchor. The more extreme the temperatures become, the more powerful they grow. Climate change isn't just affecting our world, it's helping them break through into it. This is my warning to anyone planning to visit Death Valley, especially with an RV. Stay away from Devil's Golf Course after sunset. Don't film the light on. The salt formations. If you notice sudden impossible temperature changes, power down everything immediately. No heat signature, no movement. The entities can only feed on what they can detect. But better yet, stay away completely. Some places aren't meant for human presence. Some phenomena not meant to be documented. My Winnebago sits in a storage facility now, its systems still recovering. From that night, the pipes had to be replaced, the engine block checked for stress fractures. But the real damage can't be repaired. My understanding of the natural world has been shattered. We think we know the rules that govern our reality, but places like Death Valley prove how little we truly understand. I won't be returning to document its extremes. Some stories should remain untold, some warnings left as mysteries. This is mine. The fluorescent markings on the alligator's scales shouldn't have been possible. Rachel and I had photographed hundreds of reptiles during our years documenting wildlife, but nothing like this. The pattern pulsed with an otherworldly blue light, visible even through our specialized camera filters. As a biologist, I knew this wasn't natural bioluminescence. The wavelength was all wrong, and alligators simply don't possess the biological mechanisms for it. That should have been our first warning to leave the Everglades. We should have listened. Setting up our Airstream Classic had been routine, despite the oppressive Florida humidity. Rachel arranged her photography equipment while I calibrated our scientific instruments, the familiar dance of a couple who'd spent years working together in the field. The remote spot in Shark Valley seemed perfect, isolated enough for undisturbed observation, yet still accessible by the narrow road that wound through the wetlands. We had no idea we'd chosen to park on something's ancient territory. The sun was setting when we first noticed the strange behavior of the local wildlife. The birds stopped their usual evening chorus abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence hanging over the marsh. The water rippled in patterns that didn't match the wind, and our motion sensors kept triggering despite nothing visible moving in their range. Rachel suggested we check the equipment calibration. I wish that had been the problem. Looking back, they were working perfectly. Too perfectly. They saw what we couldn't. Not yet. Old Joseph, the airboat guide we'd met earlier, had tried to warn us about this area. His weathered face had grown serious when we mentioned our research location. "Some parts of the glades don't want to be studied," he'd said, tapping a worn map. "Places where the old ones still watch." We dismissed it as local. Superstition, the kind of story tourist guides tell to add mystery to their tours. Now, I understand he was trying to save us. That first night, we set up our observation equipment around the RV. The infrared cameras were positioned to monitor animal movement patterns, while specialized light sensors would detect any bioluminescent activity. Rachel wanted to do a night shoot, hoping to capture some of the unusual glow we'd noticed. I remember checking the GPS coordinates one last time, marking our location for tomorrow's data logging. Those coordinates would become evidence in a police report that no one would believe. The trouble began at midnight. Our equipment started recording massive surges of biologic light signatures, far stronger than anything we'd documented before. The readings formed impossible patterns, organized shapes that suggested intelligence rather than random natural phenomena. Rachel's cameras captured strange light formations moving beneath the water's surface, while my instruments registered biological signatures that defied classification. The alligators began emerging from the water, each one marked with those haunting blue patterns. They moved with unnatural coordination, forming perfect circles around our campsite. I'd studied reptilian behavior for years, but this was something else entirely. Through the camera monitors, we watched in horror as more animals joined the formation: snakes, turtles, even birds, all bearing the same glowing marks. They weren't just moving together, they were being controlled. Rachel noticed it first. The patterns weren't random designs. They formed symbols, ancient glyphs that pulsed and shifted across the animal's scales and feathers. Her camera's memory cards filled with images that would later mystify every expert we consulted. The symbols seemed to flow between creatures like a living language, carrying messages we couldn't understand but could feel in our bones. Inside the RV, our scientific equipment went haywire. Readings jumped between extremes, electronics flickered, and our satellite phone died despite its full battery. Through the windows, we watched the circle of glowing wildlife tighten around us. The water level began rising impossibly fast, despite no rain. Something was drawing the swamp itself toward us, using the water as its hands. The temperature dropped suddenly, condensation forming on the windows despite the Florida heat. Through the fogged glass, we saw something rise from the water. A figure made of mist and bioluminescent patterns, its form shifting between human and animal shapes. The glowing markings on the wildlife pulsed in sync with its movements, like a conductor leading an orchestra of possessed creatures. Our cameras overloaded, trying to capture it. Water began seeping into the RV from impossible angles, moving against gravity. It carried that same otherworldly glow, painting brutal symbols across our walls and equipment. Rachel tried to document everything, her photographer's instincts still strong despite her terror. I focused on the readings, watching as every instrument registered phenomena that should have been impossible. The water wasn't just flooding in, it was searching for something. Looking back, I think it was searching for us. The possessed wildlife pressed closer, their glowing markings now blazing like blue fire. Through our cameras, we watched snakes swim through the air as if it was water, while alligators moved with the fluid grace of fish. The barrier between water and air seemed to be breaking down around us, reality becoming as fluid as the swamp itself. Our RV had become an island in an impossible sea, surrounded by creatures that no longer followed the laws of nature. Rachel grabbed my hand as the entity approached our RV. Its form had solidified into something ancient and terrifying. part tribal warrior, part prehistoric beast. The glowing patterns we'd been studying were part of its being, a language written in light that flowed through every creature under its control. The water rose faster now, covering our wheels, seeping through every seal and crack. Our equipment caught one last reading before shorting out completely. A massive surge of energy centered on an underwater structure directly beneath us. Later, research would reveal we'd parked on top of an ancient tribal site, a sacred place now hidden beneath the swamp. The entity wasn't just protecting territory, it was guarding a threshold. The glowing patterns were its warnings, marks left on those who strayed too close. The RV's metal frame groaned as something massive moved beneath us. Through the floor, we could see huge shapes swimming below, their scales marked with those same glowing symbols. The entity had called its largest servants, and they were rising to help their master remove us from its sacred ground. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before they would tear our vehicle apart. "The cameras," Rachel whispered, her voice steady despite our terror. "It's been avoiding the camera flashes." She was right. I had noticed the entity flinching away whenever her camera fired, its form becoming less solid. The bright artificial light seemed to disrupt its control over the water and wildlife. We had a weapon, but using it meant getting closer to the windows, closer to those glowing eyes that watched us through the possessed creatures. The water inside the RV was knee-deep now, glowing with that same unnatural light. Each ripple formed symbols that burned themselves into our minds. Warnings, threats, demands that we leave this sacred place. Through the windows, we could see the entity moving closer, its form flowing between shapes from tribal legends. The animals moved with it, their glowing patterns pulsing faster, more urgently. They were preparing for something. We had to act now. Rachel set up her most powerful flashes while I tried to start the engine. The possessed wildlife attacked our tires, but the RV's reinforced wheels held. The entity seemed to understand our plan. The water rose faster, and the glowing patterns began spinning, creating a vortex around us. But at least now we knew its weakness. The ancient spirit could control water, wildlife, even reality itself, but it couldn't stand against the harsh artificiality of modern light. We triggered all the flashes at once, filling the swamp with artificial daylight. The entity screamed, a sound that mixed human voices with animal calls, echoing across centuries of guardianship. The glowing patterns flickered and fragmented, its control over the water and wildlife weakening. The possessed creatures scattered, their movements becoming natural again as the spirit's influence faded. Through sheer luck, the engine roared to life. Rachel kept triggering her flashes as if lured the accelerator, our RV lurching forward through the receding water. In our mirrors, we saw the entity reform, its glowing patterns now a furious red. The swamp itself seemed to reach for us with watery hands, but we were already moving, our headlights cutting through the darkness as we fled along the narrow road. I'm writing this from a motel in Miami, where our ruined equipment lies drying in. Thasun. The water damage revealed something strange. Every piece of metal is now marked with faint symbols, visible only under ultraviolet light. They match the patterns we saw on the possessed wildlife, a permanent reminder of our encounter. Rachel's photos survived, but they show only blurry lights and strange distortions. The entity knew how to avoid leaving evidence, even as it marked us with its warning. Our research has taken a different turn now. We've spent days in local libraries, learning about tribal legends of spirit guardians who protect sacred places. The site we stumbled upon was once a ceremonial ground, used for rituals that bridged the world of spirits and flesh. The glowing patterns were its language, written in living light across the creatures under its protection. Modern development has flooded many of these sites, but that hasn't weakened their guardians. This is my warning to other researchers and travelers. Stay away from the remote parts of Shark Valley. The glowing patterns you might see on the wildlife aren't a scientific discovery waiting to be made. They're warnings from something that considers the swamp its domain. The entity doesn't hate humans, but it will defend its territory from those who would study its secrets. Some natural phenomena aren't meant to be documented. The Airstream is parked at a storage facility, its sides still bearing marks from that night. We've reported our findings as equipment malfunction and severe weather, knowing the truth would never be believed. But the local airboat guides know. They see the glowing patterns more frequently now, spreading through the swamp like a message. Development is pushing deeper into the wetlands, disturbing more sacred sites. The Guardians are rising to defend their territory. Our instruments still work, but they're different now. Every reading seems to carry an echo of that otherworldly glow, as if the entity left a piece of itself in our equipment. Sometimes, late at night, we see faint patterns moving across their screens, symbols in an ancient language, carrying warnings from the depths of the Everglades. We won't be returning to finish our research. Some places demand Tormain mysteries, their secrets guarded by forces older than science itself. There's something wrong with the winter in Tuolumne Meadows. I'm writing this from a hospital in Fresno, where my daughter Lucy is finally showing signs of warming up, 3 days after we escaped. The doctors can't explain why her core temperature dropped so low without causing permanent damage, or why frost still forms on her bedroom window in patterns that look like tiny handprints. But I know the truth. I know about Sarah and her eternal playground beneath the ice. This is my warning to other families. Stay away from Yosemite's high country in winter. Some games aren't meant to be played, and some playmates should stay buried in the snow. Our Forest River Cherokee was top of the line, equipped with every possible winter survival feature. The forecast predicted heavy snow, but nothing we couldn't handle. We'd done winter camping before. Lucy was excited about building snowmen in the meadow, and Anna had packed extra medical supplies just in case. We were prepared for the normal dangers of winter camping: the cold, the isolation, the possibility of getting snowed in. But nothing could have prepared us for what lived in the ice, for the children who had been playing their endless games since before Yosemite was a park. The first warning came just after sunset. Lucy stood at the RV window, waving at something in the darkness. "Sarah wants to play," she said, her breath not fogging the glass despite the freezing temperature. "She's been waiting a very long time for a new friend." We assumed it was her imagination, a lonely child inventing a playmate in the isolated wilderness. The meadow was empty, the snow pristine and unbroken. But when I checked our exterior cameras, I saw them. Tiny footprints appearing in the snow, forming by themselves, leading from the darkness straight to Lucy's window. The temperature dropped to impossible levels that night. Our heating system worked perfectly, but the cold wasn't natural. It bypassed our insulation, our winter gear, seeping into our bones like ancient ice. Only Lucy seemed unaffected, sitting, cross-legged on her bed, drawing picture after picture of children playing beneath a frozen lake. "Sarah showed me her friends," she explained, adding another face to her growing collection. "They've been here so long, Daddy. They just want someone new to play with." The crayon in her hand left traces of frost on the paper. Anna's nursing experience told her something was wrong with Lucy's vital signs. Our daughter's core temperature was dropping steadily, but she showed no signs of distress. Instead, she hummed unfamiliar songs, old lullabies that hadn't been sung in centuries. Through the frosted windows, we could see more footprints appearing. In the snow, dozens of them from different eras, all converging on our RV. And in the center of it all stood a small figure in a colonial dress, her form flickering between solid and transparent, her hand extended in eternal invitation to play. The radio came to life at midnight, playing fragments of children's songs. Through waves of static, forgotten melodies from every decade since Yosemite became a park. The temperature inside the RV plummeted further as frost patterns spread across our windows, forming delicate shapes that looked disturbingly like small handprints. Lucy hummed along with the phantom music, her voice harmonizing with whispers that seemed to emerge from the ice itself. Through gaps in the frost, we could see them now. Transparent figures of children from different eras, all caught in an endless game of winter tag. Our cameras captured the impossible scene unfolding outside. The child-sized footprints had multiplied, creating intricate spiral patterns in the snow. They danced outward from a strange patch of too smooth ice that shouldn't have been there, each set belonging to a different time. Modern sneakers beside colonial buckle shoes, all impossibly preserved in the endless winter of Tuolumne Meadows. Sarah stood at the center, her spectral form more solid now, conducting this macabre dance of lost souls with graceful gestures that left trails of frost in the air. The truth about Sarah and her playmates emerged through historical records on my laptop before its battery succumbed to the supernatural cold. Articles dating back to the 1800s told of children vanishing in winter storms, all in this same meadow. Each disappearance followed an identical pattern. Young victims lured into the snow by the sound of other children playing. But the articles never mentioned what we could now see through our frosted windows, that the children hadn't left. They were still here, preserved beneath the ice, playing their eternal game. And now they wanted Lucy to join them. Lucy's transformation progressed with terrifying speed. Her skin grew pale and translucent, her movements becoming fluid and graceful, as if the cold was reshaping her into something that belonged in this frozen realm. The other children pressed closer to our RV, their forms now fully visible. Transparent silhouettes of young victims claimed by the winter over centuries. Sarah remained at their center, her colonial-era dress pristine despite the passing of time, her smile visible even through the swirling snow. She raised her hand toward Lucy and our daughter reached back, frost crystallizing around her fingers. The historical record painted a clear picture of the meadow's dark history. Long before it became a national park, this area had claimed the lives of pioneers' children, then early tourists, rangers' kids, and modern campers. Each generation added to the playground beneath the ice, their final moments preserved in the endless winter. Sarah had been the first, a colonial child separated from her family during a snowstorm. But instead of passing on, she remained, gathering others to join her eternal game. Now she wanted Lucy to be the newest addition to her frozen collection. Time lost all meaning as the entities surrounded our vehicle. The metal frame groaned under the supernatural cold as ice formed inside our walls. We huddled in the center of the RV, wrapped in every blanket we had, but the cold wasn't natural. It bypassed our physical defenses, seeping directly into our souls. Through the ice-covered windows, the phantoms continued their macabre dance, their laughter a discordant melody of different eras. Lucy started naming them, reciting their stories as if she'd known them for years, sharing secrets that only the ice remembered. Sarah's influence grew stronger with each passing hour. The ice beneath our RV crackled with increasing intensity, and I realized with horror that we were sinking, not into water, but into the memories of all the winters that had claimed these children. Through the floor, we could see them suspended in the ice like insects in amber, perfectly preserved in their final moments of play. Lucy's bed had become a sheet of frost, her pillow decorated with the same intricate patterns that marked Sarah's dress. The barrier between our world and their frozen realm was dissolving, and our daughter was slipping away with it. Our daughter's transformation was nearly complete when Anna made a crucial observation. The phantoms couldn't cross certain boundaries. Lines of salt we'd scattered earlier to prevent ice formation, symbols of faith that decorated Lucy's favorite toys, the warmth of family photos that hung on our RV's walls. These remnants of life and love seemed to repel the winter's cold touch. Sarah's power had limits, and they were tied to the very thing she sought to destroy, the warmth of human connection. We had found our weapon, but using it would require a sacrifice I wasn't sure we could make. The solution revealed itself through Lucy's drawings, now frosted and brittle. Each picture showed children beneath the ice, but they weren't trapped or suffering. They were preserved in eternal play, protected from the pain of growing up, of being left behind. Sarah's game wasn't about death, it was about preventing the isolation she had experienced in her final moments. She was trying to save others from her fate, creating the family she never had. The realization hit us hard. To save Lucy, We needed to help Sarah understand that real love meant letting go. Working quickly, we covered the RV's walls with family photos, children's drawings, letters from loved ones, anything that represented the bonds Sarah and her playmates had lost. The effect was immediate and devastating. The phantoms recoiled from these symbols of living love, their forms becoming less solid. For the first time, we saw Sarah as she truly was. Not a malevolent spirit, but a terrified child who had been alone too long. The other children began to fade, their laughter turning to whispers as centuries of isolation lifted from the meadow. The final confrontation came at the darkest hour, when the barrier between our world and Sarah's frozen realm was thinnest. Lucy, even in her half-frozen state, reached out not with fear, but with compassion. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she whispered, her words carrying the warmth of true understanding. "It's okay to let go." Sarah's form flickered, colonial dress melting away to reveal the scared young girl beneath. The other children gathered around her, no longer as eternal playmates but as souls ready to find peace. Their footprints began to fade from the snow, leaving only untouched powder in their wake. Through the thinning frost, we watched the transformation spread across the meadow. The supernatural cold began to recede as Sarah's power weakened. Ice turned to mist in the pre-dawn light, releasing centuries of trapped souls. The children ascended with the evaporating frost, their forms dissolving into the first rays of sunrise. Lucy collapsed into Anna's arms, her body warming as Sarah's influence faded. Below our RV, the ancient ice melted away, revealing solid ground that had been hidden for generations. The eternal game was finally over. The park rangers found us the next morning, attracted by our emergency beacon. They were amazed we had survived the coldest night in Tuolumne Meadows' recorded history. The temperature had dropped to impossible levels, they said, breaking every record since measurements began. But they didn't know about the older cold, the deeper winter that had held Sarah and her playmates for so long. Our RV's exterior was covered in a latticework of frost patterns, tiny handprints that melted away under the rangers' flashlights, taking centuries of loneliness with them. Lucy recovered quickly, her natural warmth returning with the sun. But she was changed, carrying an understanding far beyond her years. Her new drawings showed children ascending to the sky, their faces peaceful instead of trapped. She spoke of Sarah not with fear, but with sympathy, understanding the difference between the eternal game and true family bonds. The rangers documented the strange ice formations we reported, adding them to the park's list of unexplained phenomena. They would never know how close the meadow had come to claiming another child for its frozen collection. The historical records now make more sense, viewed through the lens of our experience. Each missing child report carried the same elements: sudden cold, phantom playmates, mysterious footprints in the snow. Sarah had been trying to build a family the only way she knew how, preserving others in the moment of childhood she had lost. But her eternal winter had finally thawed, allowing her and her collected playmates to move on. The park feels different now, as if an ancient weight has lifted from the land. The rangers report fewer anomalous cold spots, fewer mysterious sounds. In winter storms, our Forest River Cherokee bears subtle marks from that night, patches where the metal frosted differently, forming patterns like colonial lace. We've kept Lucy's drawings, though the frost patterns have faded from the paper. Sometimes on cold nights we can still hear faint echoes of children's laughter in the wind. But it's different now. Peaceful, ascending, moving on. The eternal game has ended, its players finally free to leave the winter behind. But we know there are other places in the park where time runs differently, where loneliness takes physical form. The medical staff can't explain Lucy's rapid recovery. By all accounts, her exposure to such extreme cold should have caused lasting damage. Instead, she's perfectly healthy, though sometimes frost forms on her bedroom window in familiar patterns. Sarah's final gift, perhaps. A reminder that even the deepest cold can be overcome by the warmth of human connection. Lucy doesn't draw children trapped under ice anymore. Her new pictures show them soaring through sunlit skies, finally free of their eternal winter. This is my warning to families planning winter trips to Tuolumne Meadows. The danger has passed, but its memory lingers. If your children speak of playmates in the snow, of Sarah and her eternal game, don't dismiss their words. The ice has memories, and though Sarah has moved on, other spirits may still wander the winter landscape. Listen to your children, keep them close, and remember that the strongest protection against the cold isn't physical warmth, it's the unbreakable bonds of family love. The Rangers have officially attributed everything to a freak winter storm, but they've quietly added new warnings about winter camping in Tuolumne Meadows. They'll never acknowledge the true reason, that for over 2 centuries, a lonely child spirit tried to build a family the only way she knew how, preserving others in an eternal moment of play. Sarah's game is over now. Her playmates, finally, at rest, but the meadow remembers. In the deepest winter nights, when the snow falls thick and silent, you might still hear children's laughter on the wind. Our RV sits in storage now, its windows sometimes frosting over in strange patterns even. On warm days, we've tried to move on, to treat it as just another camping story to tell around the fire, but Lucy knows better. She keeps one of her old drawings pinned above her bed, a portrait of Sarah, not as the frightening spirit we encountered, but as she finally was, a lonely child who just wanted to play. She's happy now, Lucy tells us when the frost patterns appear. They all are, and in the end, that's what matters most. Some winters are meant to end, some children meant to grow up, and some games finally meant to be over. Mia was the first to notice something wrong with the canyon walls. Our geologist had already studied practically every rock formation in the Grand Canyon, but what we saw in Toroweep defied all stratigraphic logic. The layers of rock appeared to move when observed through our cameras, rearranging themselves into impossible patterns that no natural geological process could create. We shouldn't have ignored that first warning. Now Ryan is missing. Sarah still can't speak, and I'm sure something followed us back from that place. I'm writing this from a motel in Flagstaff 3 days after we managed to escape. Our Thor magnitude sits abandoned somewhere in that twisted landscape, if it even still exists in our reality. The authorities don't believe our story about shifting rock formations and ancient paintings that move when photographed. They're still searching for Ryan in all the wrong places, using maps that no longer match the territory we experienced. But I need to warn others before they make the same mistake we did. The Grand Canyon hides something in its depths, something that doesn't want to be discovered. Nossa viagem começou como uma última aventura antes de seguirmos caminhos diferentes após a formatura. Mia queria estudar algumas formações geológicas únicas. Ryan planejava fotos para seu portfólio. Sarah estava interessada em possíveis sítios arqueológicos e eu cuidaria da logística e documentação digital. O RV era novo, equipado, com todos os recursos para uma semana de exploração off-grid. Chegamos ao Toroweep Overlook no fim da tarde, quando o sol transformava o canyon em um caleidoscópio de sombras. O local estava deserto, como esperávamos. Mas não estávamos sozinhos. The first set of petroglyphs we found should have been our warning to leave. They weren't in any archaeological survey, and Sarah said their style didn't match known Native American art from the region. The symbols seemed to shift when viewed through our cameras, rearranging themselves into new patterns with each photo. Ryan became obsessed with capturing the changes, convinced it would make his career. He spent hours photographing the same panel, comparing images that showed impossible variations. That night, we heard the first screams echoing from the canyon. Depths, sounds that shouldn't have carried so far in the still desert air. Our RV's GPS started showing inconsistencies by the second day. The coordinates would jump around, sometimes placing us miles from our actual location. The road we'd driven in on seemed to change direction every time we checked our maps. We tried not to panic, assuming it was equipment malfunction from the remote location. Then Mia discovered something in her geological surveys. The rock layers around us didn't match any known formation in the Grand Canyon. It was as if we'd driven into a completely different reality, one where the fundamental rules of geology no longer applied. Every photo Ryan took revealed a different version of reality. The petroglyphs morphed between images, forming patterns that Sarah said resembled warnings in ancient languages that shouldn't exist here. Our phones and cameras showed timestamps that didn't match, locations that were impossible, and images that degraded into abstract patterns of light and shadow. The GPS continued its erratic behavior, now showing us moving even when the RV was parked. The technology wasn't malfunctioning. It was trying to process multiple versions of reality simultaneously. The canyon walls began to shift more dramatically as night fell. Mia's geological instruments recorded impossible data: rock formations, aging thousands of years between readings, mineral compositions changing by the minute. The RV's metal frame groaned as if under immense pressure, though our altitude readings remained stable. Through our windows, we watched the cliff faces ripple, like water, ancient layers of rock flowing into new configurations. The rational part of my mind tried to find explanations, but there was no scientific justification for what we were witnessing. Sarah spent hours trying to translate the changing petroglyphs, her archaeological training failing her as the symbols shifted through writing systems that had never existed in human history. She managed to capture one consistent pattern: a warning about guardians who protected something hidden in the canyon's depths, entities that could bend reality to prevent discovery of their secrets. The petroglyphs seemed to respond to her attempts at translation, the symbols becoming more complex, more urgent in their message. That's when Ryan decided to venture closer to the canyon edge for better photos. We heard his scream just after sunset. Ryan had set up his camera near a particularly active section of petroglyphs, determined to document the changes. Through the RV's windows, we watched in horror as the rock face seemed to reach out, the ancient symbols flowing like liquid stone. The cliff edge he stood on rippled, and then he was gone, not falling, but absorbed into the living rock. The camera remained, but when we checked the footage later, each frame showed a different version of Ryan's disappearance, as if multiple realities had converged at that moment. Sarah was the first to notice they were hurting us. Each time we tried to leave, the road would shift, leading us back to the overlook. The canyon walls moved subtly, changing the landscape around us until our maps became useless. We were trapped in a maze that constantly rebuilt itself, guided by ancient forces that saw our presence as an intrusion. That night, the petroglyphs began to glow with their own light, and we heard sounds from the depths. Not echoes, but the voices of those who had been trapped here before, their warnings distorted by layers of twisted reality. The third day brought understanding, but too late to help Ryan. Mia's geological analysis revealed that the rock wasn't just moving. It was living memory, encoded in stone eons ago by whatever force protected this place. The shifting formations were pages in an ancient book, telling stories of other groups who had ventured too close to the canyon's secrets. Each layer held fragments of lost expeditions, their fates literally written in stone. We found Ryan's name forming in newly created petroglyphs, his story already becoming part of the canyon's eternal record. Sarah's translations became more coherent as the entities controlling the canyon decided to communicate. The symbols revealed fragments of their purpose. They were guardians set in place by ancient peoples, tasked with protecting something buried deep in the canyon's heart. The constantly shifting landscape was their defense mechanism, designed to disorient and trap those who might threaten their eternal vigil. Modern technology posed a new threat: our cameras and instruments capable of documenting and potentially exposing their secrets. They responded by turning our own devices against us. Our RV became our prison that night. The metal walls rippled like the canyon rock, windows showing different views every time we looked through them. Time began to distort. Our phones showed impossible hours. The sun seemed to rise and set at random intervals. We heard Ryan's voice calling from different directions, but the words made no sense, as if he was speaking from multiple timelines simultaneously. Sarah tried to record the phenomena but found her videos contained footage we hadn't shot yet, showing versions of our fate we desperately needed to avoid. The Guardians took physical form as the barrier between realities weakened. They emerged. From the stone like liquid shadows, their forms combining elements of every culture that had ever inhabited the canyon. Ancient symbols swirled across their surfaces. The same writings that had warned us away now animated with terrible purpose. They pressed closer to our RV, and where they touched, the metal transformed into stone, our shelter slowly becoming part of their domain. We realized we had a choice: leave immediately or join Ryan in becoming part of the canyon's eternal story. Mia saved us with her geological knowledge. She noticed that the Guardian's influence weakened near certain mineral formations, remnants of the natural world that resisted their reality-bending powers. Using her samples as a compass, we plotted a course through the shifting maze. The entities tried to stop us, changing the landscape with increasing desperation, but they couldn't alter the fundamental properties of these specific rocks. We followed this trail of geological breadcrumbs, watching reality twist and reform around us as we finally escaped their territory. The Guardians mounted their final assault as we fled. The very air became fluid, filled with fragments of every timeline they controlled. Through our warping windows, we saw versions of ourselves who hadn't escaped, their fates playing out in endless loops. The canyon walls rippled with increasing violence, ancient petroglyphs flowing like rivers of light as the entities tried to rewrite the reality around our escaping RV. Sarah's camera, still recording, captured impossible images of landscapes that existed centuries ago, mixed with visions of futures that would never come to pass. Navigation became a nightmare of quantum uncertainty. Every mirror showed a different version of the road ahead. Each GPS reading suggested a different location. I drove by instinct alone, following Mia's guidance as she held her precious mineral samples like divining rods. The stones vibrated in, her hands resonating with their unchanged counterparts in the canyon walls. We wound through a maze of possibilities, each turn taking us through alternate versions of the landscape. Behind us, the Guardian's influence began to fade, reality slowly solidifying into a single, stable timeline. Our RV preserved evidence of our passage through fractured reality. The metal hull had partially transformed into stone in places, engraved, with petroglyphs that still shifted and changed when photographed. The electronics were permanently altered, screens showing overlapping images from multiple timelines. Most of our photos and videos were corrupted, showing impossible scenes that hurt the eyes to look at. But Sarah's final translations remained, burned into her notebook in scripts that Scholar would later claim couldn't exist. The Guardians had let us leave, but they ensured we carried proof that would make our story unbelievable. The search for Ryan continues, but we know they'll never find him. The coordinates we provided lead to different locations each time they're checked, the canyon's Guardians still protecting their secrets. Sometimes, when I process the corrupted images from our cameras, I catch glimpses of him in the twisted, rock faces. Not trapped or suffering, but transformed, becoming part of the ancient force that guards the canyon's mysteries. The petroglyphs tell his story now, a warning to others who might venture too close to truths humanity isn't meant to discover. We made camp that final night at a safe distance, watching the sun set over an unmoving canyon that looked nothing like the reality-bending maze we'd escaped. The authorities arrived the next morning, responding to the missing person report we'd managed to file once our phones had signal again. They searched the area we described but found only normal rock, formations, and ancient, unchanging petroglyphs. The Guardians had erased all evidence of their existence, leaving only our corrupted technology and haunted memories as proof of what we'd experienced. I'm writing this from my apartment in Phoenix, surrounded by geological samples that still resonate with unexplainable energy and electronics that never quite work right anymore. Mia continues to analyze the stone fragments we escaped with, discovering properties that shouldn't exist in natural rock. Sarah has filled notebooks with translations of messages she glimpsed in the shifting petroglyphs, each page containing warnings about the price of disturbing ancient Guardians. Our devices still show glitches. Photos that change when no one's looking, GPS coordinates that drift through impossible locations. The official report labels Ryan as missing, presumed lost in a hiking accident. They don't believe our story about reality-bending guardians and living rock. The search teams found nothing unusual at Torowep Overlook, though they reported strange equipment malfunctions and inconsistent compass readings. The canyon's guardians have hidden themselves again, waiting for the next group of explorers who venture too close to their secrets. But they left their mark on us. We see the world differently now, knowing that reality is more fluid than we ever imagined. This is my warning to other explorers planning to visit the remote areas of Grand Canyon. Stay away from Torowep Overlook. Don't photograph the petroglyphs that seem to change when you're not looking. If your GPS starts showing impossible locations, or your cameras capture images that don't match your memories, leave immediately. The Guardians have protected their secrets for millennia, and they'll continue to twist reality itself to maintain their vigil. Some mysteries are meant to remain hidden, some boundaries never meant to be crossed. Our Thor Magnitude was declared a total loss, its partially petrified frame too altered to be repaired. The insurance company blamed it on vandalism, unable to explain the sections of metal transformed to living rock or the ever-changing symbols etched into its surface. We've tried to move on with our lives, but the experience has left its mark on more than just our equipment. We see the fluidity of reality now, the places where ancient forces still hold sway over the modern world. The Canyon's Guardians let us leave with our story, but they kept a piece of us with them. Ryan's family still hopes he'll be found, but we know better. In quiet moments, when I look at the corrupted photos from that final evening, I sometimes catch glimpses of him in the twisted stone, his form merging with the ancient guardians. He's become part of their eternal vigil, his story written in shifting petroglyphs that warn others away from truths humanity isn't ready to understand. The Grand Canyon holds secrets deeper than its physical depths, protected by forces that can bend reality itself to keep them hidden. Remember our story, and let some mysteries remain unexplored. Anyone who follows landscape photography knows about the legendary light of Monument Valley. For 30 years, I've captured the interplay of sun and stone across the American Southwest, but nothing prepared me for what I witnessed in the shadow of East Mitten Butte. The authorities dismissed my photos as dust-distorted images, tricks of light through the storm. But I know what I saw in the dancing shadows that night. More importantly, I know what saw me back. This is my warning to other photographers. Some landmarks aren't meant to be captured. Some shadows should remain unphotographed. The storm was supposed to be perfect, a rare winter tempest that would paint the desert in extraordinary light. My Winnebago Vista was specially outfitted for desert conditions, with reinforced filters and sealed camera equipment. I'd chosen a remote spot with an unobstructed view of East Mitten Butte, far from the tourist overlooks. Old Joseph Begay at the Navajo Cultural Center had warned me about photographing during what he called the walking storm, but I'd heard similar warnings before. 30 years of photography had taught me to trust my equipment and experience. That trust almost cost me my life. The first anomalies appeared in my test shots just before sunset. The shadows cast by the buttes didn't match the angle of the sun. They stretched in impossible directions, forming shapes that suggested human figures in motion. I checked my lenses for dust contamination, recalibrated my sensors, but every image showed the same thing. The shadows were moving independently of their sources, flowing across the desert floor like dark water. As I reviewed the photos on my laptop, I noticed something even more disturbing. The shadows seemed to be getting closer to my RV with each shot. Joseph's warning echoed in my mind as the storm approached. He'd spoken of ancient beings that walked between worlds, using shadows as doorways during specific storms. They remember every image ever taken of them, he'd said, his weathered hands tracing symbols in the air. And they don't like being caught on film. The dark clouds on the horizon moved against the wind, gathering around East Mitten Butte like a cloak. Through my camera's viewfinder, I watched impossible shapes form in the growing darkness. That's when I heard the first footsteps circling my RV, steady and deliberate despite the empty desert around me. The storm hit just after sunset, but the darkness it brought wasn't natural. My external cameras captured images that defied explanation, shadows that moved through the swirling sand like living things, taking forms that shifted between human and animal. The sand itself seemed alive, flowing in patterns that matched ancient petroglyphs I'd photographed earlier. Each lightning flash revealed figures standing in impossible places among the buttes, their forms too tall and angular to be human. My cameras started capturing images on their own, filling their memory cards with photos of things that lurked just at the edge of visibility. The tempest intensified as night fell completely. The wind howled with voices that almost formed words in languages that hadn't been spoken for centuries. My weather equipment registered impossible readings, pressure changes that should have torn the RV apart, wind patterns that violated basic physics. The shadows I'd photographed began manifesting physically, seeping under my door like black water, carrying with them the scent of ancient stone and something else, a predatory musk that triggered primal warning signals in my brain. The storm wasn't just weather, it was a hunting ground. Every photo I'd taken since arriving began to change. Images stored on my cameras and laptop transformed before my eyes, showing different versions of the same scene. The shadows grew more distinct in each iteration, revealing forms that became increasingly humanoid. In the latest versions, they were clearly looking at the camera, looking at me. The timestamps showed these changes happening backwards through time, as if the entities had been retroactively inserting themselves into every photo I'd taken. They weren't just in the images, they were actively haunting my entire photographic record. The RV's metal walls offered no protection from what hunted outside. The beings moved through solid matter as easily as through shadows, leaving behind marks that burned cold to the touch. Each new lightning flash illuminated their shapes through the walls, elongated figures that towered over my vehicle, their forms rippling between human and animal aspects. My cameras continued firing automatically, capturing images that made less sense with each exposure. The digital sensors were registering spectrums of light that shouldn't exist, documenting the movements of creatures that straddled dimensions. Ancient memories leaked through my cameras along with the strange images. Glimpses of Monument Valley from centuries past, shadows that had stalked these lands long before photography existed. I saw through eyes both human and other, witnessed ceremonies and hunts that history had forgotten. The storm outside was more than weather. It was a thinning of reality itself, a moment when ancient powers could step through the shadows they'd inhabited since time immemorial. And my cameras, my hubris in trying to capture this sacred place, had drawn their attention. The entities began testing my defenses, pressing against the RV's walls with a cold that went beyond physical sensation. They whispered in languages that hurt my ears, speaking directly to primitive parts of my brain that recognized the sound of predators in the dark. My equipment began to fail systematically. First the exterior cameras, then my laptop, finally my handheld cameras. Each device died displaying one final image, a clear shot of a figure that combined human, animal, and shadow in ways that defied comprehension. They wanted me to see them clearly before they took me. The creatures revealed themselves fully as my last camera died. They emerged from every shadow cast by my RV's interior lights, their forms flowing between shapes that belonged to different species, different dimensions. Through the windshield, I watched more of them step out of the monoliths themselves, as if the great stone formations were merely doorways for their kind. The storm acted as their medium, carrying them on currents of sand and shadow toward my vehicle. Each lightning flash now showed them in different positions, like frames in a stop-motion film of their approach. My extensive photography experience became my curse. I could perceive details my mind tried to reject. The way their movements followed. Impossible geometries. how their shadows fell in directions that didn't match any light source. They were hunters, yes, but not just of flesh and blood. They hunted images, moments, the very act of being perceived. Each photograph I'd taken had created a connection, a thread they could follow back to me. The storm wasn't just their hunting ground. It was their manifestation, their shared body made of wind and sand and darkness. The temperature inside the RV dropped to impossible levels as they pressed closer. Frost formed on every surface, creating patterns that mimicked the ancient petroglyphs I'd photographed earlier. The beings moved through these patterns like a script, each position corresponding to symbols whose meanings I was beginning to grasp too late. My cameras had captured more than images. They'd recorded a language written in shadow and light, a story of ancient hunters and their eternal hunt. I was not their first photographer victim, nor would I be their last. Their method of attack proved more subtle and terrible than I'd imagined. Rather than break in directly, they began extracting every photograph I'd ever taken, not just from my devices, but from my memories. I felt decades of work being pulled from my mind like threads from a tapestry. Each image they took created a new shadow inside my thoughts, a space where something else could enter. They weren't just going to kill me. They were going to replace every photograph in my mind with a window through which they could emerge at will. I survived only because I finally understood what Joseph had tried to warn me about. The beings weren't camera shy. They were camera hungry. Each photograph taken during their storm created another portal, another way for them to expand their hunting ground beyond the valley. My cameras hadn't just documented their existence. They'd given them new shadows to inhabit, new paths into the modern world. As this realization hit me, I did the only thing I could. I began deleting every image I'd taken, burning my memory cards, sacrificing my life's work to close the doors I'd unknowingly opened. The entities reacted violently to the destruction of their new portals. The storm intensified beyond meteorological possibility, sand and shadow forming tentacles that probed my RV for weaknesses. Inside, I worked frantically to erase every digital image, every piece of film. Each deleted photograph weakened their connection to my reality, forced them back into their original shadows. But they had already taken root in my mind, leaving spaces in my memories that ached like phantom limbs. I could feel them trying to fill these voids, attempting to replace my lost images with their own dark reflections. Time became fluid as I fought my way through their influence. Moments stretched and compressed, the storm outside cycling through days of weather in minutes. Through my windshield, I watched Monument Valley age centuries between lightning flashes, saw shadows that belonged to different eras trying to manifest simultaneously. The beings existed in all these times at once, using the shadows of every age as their domain. My photographs had created bridges between these periods, and now those bridges were burning, taking parts of my identity with them. The final confrontation came as I reached my oldest memory cards, the ones containing my first photographs of the Southwest. The entities had grown strongest in these images, using years of viewing and reproduction to reinforce their new doorways. As I began deleting them, the shadows came alive with desperate fury. They showed me visions of my past work, offered to restore every image I'd lost, promised to make me the most renowned photographer in history. All I had to do was keep one photograph, leave one shadow door open for their use. Their true form became clear in that moment of temptation. I saw them as they existed across all times, ancient spirits that had adapted to each era's way of capturing images. Cave paintings, petroglyphs, drawings, photographs, all were potential doorways for their kind. But modern photography had given them unprecedented access to human perception. Every digital image shared online, every backed-up photograph in cloud storage created new spaces for them to inhabit. They weren't just hunting me, they were using my work to expand their hunting ground to the entire digital world. Dawn arrived. Suddenly, as if the night had been snatched away by the same forces that were retreating from my RV. The storm dissipated with unnatural speed, leaving behind a pristine desert morning. My cameras were fried, their memory cards warped and useless. Every digital image I'd taken was corrupted beyond recovery. 30 years of photography had been reduced to shadow and static, a sacrifice to close the doors I'd opened. But as I watched the sun rise over East Mitten Butte, I noticed something that chilled me more than the night's horrors. The monolith no longer cast a shadow, as if something had claimed it permanently for its own. I'm writing this from a motel in Page, Arizona, where my ruined equipment sits in boxes ready for insurance claims I can't possibly file truthfully. The Winnebago is at a local mechanic's, its electrical systems mysteriously corroded, its metal skin etched with patterns that match no known petroglyphs. The mechanics can't explain why the shadows inside the RV don't always match the position of the sun, or why their diagnostic computers keep showing impossible errors. Sometimes I catch movements in those shadows that remind me too much of that night. The loss of my photographic archive hurts more than any physical injury could. Decades of work, countless moments captured across the Southwest, all sacrificed to close the doorways I'd unknowingly opened. My mind still aches where the images used to be, phantom memories that twinge like missing teeth. Worse are the spaces they left behind, shadows in my thoughts that sometimes seem to move when I'm not paying attention. I've stopped taking photographs entirely. The risk of opening another portal is too great. This is my warning to other photographers. Planning to shoot in Monument Valley, stay away from the remote areas during storms. If you see shadows that don't match their sources, if you capture images that seem to change between viewings, delete them immediately. Don't check them first. Don't try to document the changes, just destroy them. The beings that hunt in the walking storm don't just want to be photographed. They want to use our modern technology to expand their ancient hunting grounds. Every photograph of their domain becomes a door they can step through. The Navajo Nation has quietly added new restrictions on photography in certain areas, though they don't specify the real reasons. Joseph tells me the shadow hunters have been more active lately, drawn by the explosion of digital photography and social media. Every shared image of their territory creates new shadows for them to inhabit. They're adapting to our modern world, learning to move through digital spaces like they once moved through physical shadows. The storm I witnessed was just the beginning of their expansion. My cameras remain in storage, their lenses covered. I've refused several prestigious assignments, turned down magazine work that once would have thrilled me. Some colleagues think I've lost my edge, that the desert, finally, got to me, but sometimes, reviewing their photos of Monument Valley, I see familiar shapes forming in the shadows. The hunters are still there, waiting in every image, using our endless documentation of the world as their new hunting ground. Remember, my warning, some subjects aren't meant to be photographed. Some shadows should be left unexplored, some stories left untold. This is mine. The human ear can detect frequencies between 20 and 20,000 hertz. But something in Carlsbad Caverns was communicating well below that range. Our equipment picked it up first, infrasonic pulses that shouldn't exist naturally in limestone caves. The patterns suggested intelligence, a rhythmic organization that mimicked human speech. Carlos thought we'd discovered a breakthrough in cave acoustics. Instead, we'd attracted the attention of something that had been waiting in the deep frequencies since before humans first entered these caverns. I'm still trying to explain why my brother's voice now echoes in tunnels that don't exist on any map. The Newmars specialized recording equipment was running before we even parked. Carlos had insisted on capturing the acoustic profile of our approach, especially the way sound traveled through the newly discovered entrance. The readings were odd from the start. Reverberations that continued long after they should have died out. Echoes that returned from impossible angles. The cave seemed to be playing back our sounds like a broken record, adding layers of distortion that grew more complex with each repetition. We thought it was a unique geological phenomenon. We didn't understand we were hearing its hunting call. The first clear warning came during our equipment test. Carlos had developed a new technique for mapping cave systems using acoustic reflections, like sonar but with broader frequency coverage. The initial data showed tunnels that contradicted the official surveys, passages that twisted in ways that violated known geology, chambers that seemed to move between scans. When we played back our test recordings, we heard voices mixed in, with the cave noise, distant conversations in languages that sound specialists would later fail to identify. The cave was singing to us, using our own equipment to compose its dark symphony. Ground-penetrating radar showed only solid limestone where our acoustic maps indicated tunnels. The contradiction should have been our signal to leave. Instead, Carlos suggested we set up additional microphones, excited by the possibility of documenting an unknown acoustic phenomenon. The readings fascinated him, infrasonic frequencies organizing themselves into patterns that almost formed words, harmonics that shouldn't have been possible in a natural cave system. That night, as we reviewed the data in our RV, we discovered that the cave wasn't just echoing our sounds, it was learning from them. The cavern's responses grew more sophisticated with each recording. Our microphones captured fragments of what sounded like human conversations, but played backwards and distorted into new meanings. Equipment that should have shown empty tunnels revealed vast chambers filled with acoustic energy, spaces that somehow existed in the frequency domain rather than physical space. Carlos spent hours analyzing the patterns, trying to decode what he believed was an attempted communication. He didn't realize that by focusing so intently on those deep frequencies, he was allowing something to learn his voice, to understand how human sounds could be taken apart and repurposed. Our second day began with every piece of recording equipment activated simultaneously, an event neither of us had triggered. Each device captured a different layer of what seemed to be the same impossible sound, a harmony of voices that included fragments of our own conversations from the previous day, but twisted and combined with older recordings we'd never made. The cave had been collecting sounds, building a library of human voices it could manipulate. When we played the recordings together, they formed coherent sentences in dozens of languages, all asking us to venture deeper into unmapped tunnels. Carlos was the first to notice the pattern in the infrasonic pulses, a mathematical sequence that matched the resonant frequencies of human vocal cords. The cave wasn't just recording and playing back sounds, it was analyzing the fundamental mechanics of human speech. Our equipment showed the infrasonic waves forming standing patterns in the air, creating nodes of absolute silence surrounded by shells of concentrated acoustic energy. These nodes began to move purposefully through the cave system, like sound-based predators hunting by echolocation. The cave was treating our voices like bait in an elaborate acoustic trap. The entity revealed more of its nature through our recordings. Spectrographic analysis showed it existing primarily in frequencies below human hearing, rising into audible ranges only to mimic and manipulate the voices it had collected. It could generate infrasonic pulses powerful enough to alter human consciousness, creating auditory hallucinations that drew victims deeper into its domain. The acoustic maps became increasingly unreliable as the creature learned to manipulate our equipment, generating false readings that made dead ends appear as exits and hiding deadly drops behind phantom reflections. By sunset, the cave's acoustic presence had invaded our RV. Every speaker, every piece of recording equipment became a conduit for its influence. It played back fragments of conversations from previous visitors, their voices distorted by their time in its collection. We heard children laughing deep in tunnels that hadn't existed hours before, couples calling to each other across impossible acoustic spaces, all manipulated to create an irresistible urge to follow the sounds to their source. The creature was using human empathy against us, playing on our instinct to help those who sound lost or distressed. That night, we discovered how it hunted. The infrasonic pulses would create standing waves that could physically manipulate the limestone, opening temporary tunnels that existed more as acoustic phenomena than physical spaces. These sound-constructed passages would hold their form just long enough for victims to enter, then collapse back into solid rock, trapping them in spaces that existed only in the frequency domain. Our equipment detected hundreds of these acoustic pockets throughout the cave system, each one containing the preserved voices of those it had captured, their calls for help serving as lures for new victims. The third day brought understanding of the entity's true form. It wasn't just manipulating sound, it was a being composed entirely of acoustic energy, using infrasonic frequencies to interact with physical matter. The cave system wasn't its habitat, it was its body, a massive, resonating chamber it had shaped over millennia. Every tunnel was an acoustic waveguide, every chamber a carefully tuned resonator. The strange formations we'd documented weren't geological anomalies, but acoustic structures, physical manifestations of its attempt to optimize the cave for its hunting frequencies. Carlos became obsessed with understanding its acoustic nature. He developed new theories about frequency-based life forms, beings that existed primarily as patterns of vibration. His recordings revealed increasingly complex organizations in the infrasonic range, what he interpreted as language, culture, even architecture expressed purely through sound. But as he studied its frequencies, it studied his voice, learning to replicate his speech patterns with growing accuracy. Each recording session gave it more material to work with, more ways to manipulate human perception through carefully crafted acoustic illusions. The creature began actively hunting us that afternoon. It used its mastery of acoustics to reshape the cave's architecture around us, creating labyrinthine spaces that existed simultaneously as physical tunnels and standing waves. Our mapping equipment showed these hybrid spaces constantly shifting, rearranging themselves according to patterns in the infrasonic background. The entity had learned to use our own voices as templates, generating phantom calls that seemed to come from versions of ourselves trapped in its acoustic maze. Each cry for help was perfectly crafted to resonate with our individual vocal frequencies. Carlos ventured too close to one of its acoustic constructs, drawn by what sounded like his own voice calling from a newly formed tunnel. The passage appeared solid in our helmet lights, but our instruments showed it existing primarily as a complex pattern of standing waves, held together by the entity's infrasonic manipulation of the limestone. I watched in horror as he stepped into the threshold, his body seeming to vibrate in sympathy with the tunnel's resonant frequency. The passage sealed behind him with a sound like a massive bass drop, leaving no trace in the physical rock but registering as an active acoustic space in our equipment. The cave's response was immediate and terrible. Every speaker in our possession began playing Carlos's voice, but not as single recordings. It had deconstructed his speech into fundamental frequencies, allowing it to generate new sentences and expressions he had never actually spoken. I heard him calling from dozens of different tunnels simultaneously, each voice layered with subtle infrasonic frequencies designed to draw me deeper into the cave's acoustic maze. The entity wasn't just mimicking him, it had captured the very essence of his voice, adding it to its collection of acoustic lures. Our RV became my fortress as I frantically analyzed the data, searching for ways to understand what had taken my brother. The acoustic maps revealed a horrifying truth. The entity had been engineering this cave system for thousands of years, tuning its chambers and passages to resonate with human vocal frequencies. Each person it captured contributed to its acoustic evolution, their voices becoming part of its growing ability to manipulate sound and matter. Carlos wasn't its first victim, but his expertise in acoustics made him an especially valuable addition to its collection. The true nature of its hunting strategy became clear through spectrographic analysis. The creature used infrasonic frequencies to create zones of altered physics, spaces where sound waves could temporarily replace solid matter. These acoustic constructs appeared as normal cave passages but existed primarily in the frequency domain, allowing it to trap victims in dimensional pockets sustained by specific resonances. Each chamber in our acoustic maps contained unique vocal signatures, the preserved sounds of everyone it had captured, their voices sustained indefinitely in its infrasonic architecture. Rescue was impossible by conventional means. The tunnels, that had swallowed Carlos existed only as acoustic phenomena, maintained by the entity's constant infrasonic manipulation. Ground-penetrating radar showed solid limestone where our audio equipment detected complex spaces filled with captured voices. The creature had created a parallel dimension of pure sound, a labyrinth of acoustic chambers where it could keep its victims' voices eternally resonating. Physical excavation would be useless. The spaces holding its collection didn't exist in normal space-time. The entity grew bolder as night fell, using its expanded vocal range to generate increasingly sophisticated lures. It played conversations between Carlos and myself that had never happened, recreating his voice with perfect fidelity while layering in infrasonic frequencies designed to overcome rational thought. The acoustic traps it generated became more elaborate, combining multiple captured voices to create convincing scenes of other people exploring or calling for help. Each phantom sound was engineered to resonate with specific human psychological responses, triggering instincts to help or investigate. My last recording of Carlos exists now as a warning and a wound. His voice, preserved in digital format, remains untainted by the entity's influence. But in the cave, I can still hear it using his acoustic signature to generate new sounds, new words, new lures for future victims. The infrasonic pulses continue to shape and reshape the cave's architecture, creating temporary passages that lead to its acoustic dimension. The creature is still there, still collecting voices, still using human sounds to expand its harmonic empire deep beneath the Earth's surface. I'm writing this from a research facility in New Mexico, where acoustic experts are still trying to analyze our recordings. The Newmar sits in an electromagnetic shielded chamber, its speakers occasionally activating to play fragments of conversations that never took place. The cave's influence lingers in every piece of equipment we used, its infrasonic signatures, permanently embedded in their circuitry. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Carlos's voice emanating from unpowered devices, speaking words that could only come from the entity's acoustic manipulation. The official investigation reached no conclusions. The cave entrance we discovered has been sealed, officially due to structural instability. But the real reason is hidden in our acoustic data, evidence of a frequency-based intelligence that defies current scientific understanding. The entity continues its work, its infrasonic pulses detectable even through solid rock. New acoustic maps show its territory expanding, tunnels that exist only in sound spreading like roots through the limestone. Each new victim adds to its vocabulary, its ability to manipulate human perception through carefully crafted acoustic illusions. This is my warning to others planning to explore Carlsbad Caverns. Stay away from unmarked entrances, from passages that don't appear on official maps. If you hear voices calling from tunnels that shouldn't exist, if your recordings contain sounds you can't explain, leave immediately. The creature that hunts in those deep frequencies is still growing, still learning, still collecting voices for its eternal acoustic archive. It understands human speech better now, thanks to Carlos's expertise. His voice joins countless others in its harmonic collection, calling endlessly through tunnels that exist only in sound. The academic community dismisses my theories about frequency-based life forms and acoustic dimensions. But the evidence remains, in our recordings, proof of an intelligence that exists primarily as patterns of sound, using infrasonic frequencies to manipulate physical reality. The entity continues to evolve, its acoustic architecture growing more sophisticated as it adds new voices to its collection. Each victim contributes to its understanding of human speech, its ability to generate perfect lures from captured vocal fragments. The cave system has become its instrument, every chamber and passage tuned to resonate with its hunting frequencies. Our equipment remains quarantined, too dangerous to use but too valuable to destroy. The acoustic data we collected reveals a fraction of the entity's true nature, a being that evolved to exist in the space between sound and matter, using infrasonic frequencies to bridge dimensions we barely understand. Carlos's voice echoes somewhere in that acoustic maze, preserved in patterns of vibration that will resonate until the limestone itself crumbles. The caves hold their secrets in frequencies too deep for human ears, in spaces that exist only in sound. Remember my warning. Some voices are better left unrecorded, some sounds better left unheard.